So the topic which has been given to me is to analyze some of the latest decisions of the Honorable Supreme Court. And I picked about 10 decisions, 10 to 12 decisions, and thought we will spend some time in trying to understand these. So as I said earlier, I've chosen about 10 decisions which I thought could be of relevance, and these relate to varied areas in the income tax. And one of them could even touch upon the Black Money Act, if you could recall the case of the Supreme Court in Ketan's decision. And we will try to analyze and try to have our own views in respect of various findings recorded by the Supreme Court in respect of this decision. And I would request the delegates to raise questions as soon as we finish each case law. We needn't wait till the end. After each case law is discussed, possibly there could be questions. We'll see how things go. And if the questions become highly unmanageable, in which case we will possibly defer the questions to the end for the last 10 minutes or so. Now, before we get into the there are a few important principles which will have to be kept in mind as we analyze these decisions, which will center on this doctrine of the precedence law. Here is a case where, every word of a decision of a Supreme Court needn't be treated as a statute. The judges interpret only statutes, and the judgment shouldn't be interpreted as, statutes as such. The words will not have to be interpreted as statutes. And the observations of the courts shouldn't be treated as excludes theorems. Rather, they has to be applied in the particular context in which we fit in. Because if you look at a fleet of decisions, you will have decisions suggesting you either way. So what fits into your factual matrix is something that decides your case. And it is in the fitness of things for the lawyers to ensure that their factual matrix would, as much as possible, match with those of the case which they are trying to rely before any other court of law in which they are representing their case. Now we'll start with this decision of Supreme Court in Dalmia Power Limited, 428 TR 339. It's an interesting case of merger and amalgamation. Here is a case where the concerned assessment year is 2016-17, and there are two major companies like Dalmia Cements and Dalmia Power. About 9 other companies in the group got amalgamated with these two companies. So there were about 11 companies in the group, 9 companies amalgamated with these two companies. So 9 transferor companies and 2 transferee companies. The appointed date in the scheme is 1/1/2015. So it fell in the previous year, 14-15. It so happened that though the appointed date was 1/1/15, eventually the transfer could take place much later because it involved intervention of courts, distinct high courts like Guwahati High Court, Chennai High Court, etc., because it had interstate companies which were to be amalgamated. And as a result whereof, although the appointed date is 1/1/2015, the actual order of the court came much, much later. So what the transferee companies, these two companies did is, they revised the returns which they filed on 27/11/2018 for the assessment year 16-17. In these revised returns, they claimed losses. But these returns were filed beyond 139.5 time limit. As the 139.5 then stood, for the assessment year 16-17, the time limit was 1 year from the end of the relevant assessment year. So it lapsed on 31/3/2018, whereas the revised returns were filed on 27/11/2018. What the department did is it initially issued notice under 143(2) to process these revised returns, but later on it withdrew the notices. It withdrew the notices on the premise that these revised returns were filed beyond 139.5. And hence, the department's stand is that we will ignore the revised returns, we will consider only the original returns. Whereas because after the amalgamation, there were losses of the transferor companies, the transferee company wanted to claim this loss and filed its return under 139(5), seeking to claim the benefit of loss, which in effect the department was wanting to deny. So the matter went to the single judge of the Honorable Madras High Court, who upheld the view of the SSC and said that 139(5) would not apply and the revised return will have to be accepted. But when the matter went to the division bench, the Honorable Division Bench of Madras High Court said that it is not permissible. You have to seek the intervention of CBDT unless and until you obtain the consent of the CBDT under 119(2)(a. Your revised returns cannot be accepted. So this made the SSCs to come to the Supreme Court. Now the Supreme Court noted a few things, which inter alia included that when the matter of amalgamation was going on in the various courts, in terms of section 230 subsection 5 of the Companies Act, notices were sent to the departmental officials also. They were expected to raise objections within 30 days. Even as per Rule 8.3 of the Companies Compromises, Arrangements and Amalgamation Rules 2016, they have to reply within 30 days. If they do not reply within 13 days, then it shall be deemed that they will not have any objections. In the instant case, when the notices were issued to the department in the course of the NCLT proceedings, the department did not raise any objection whatsoever. And what the Supreme Court said is, because the department did not raise any objection, the amalgamation has now become some sort of an order in rem. It is not just an order in personam, it's also an order in rem. It will bind all the authorities and the public at large. And therefore, the Supreme Court said that the provisions of 139(5) cannot be implemented here, cannot be applied here. 139(5) would apply only in a case where there is an omission or a wrong statement. Here is a case where there is absolutely no omission or wrong statement. In fact, the scheme of the amalgamation very clearly provided that the transferee companies, the amalgamated companies, without prejudice to their claim of losses, etc., can always make the belated claims. This is part of the amalgamation scheme, and accordingly, the Honorable Supreme Court said that it is not right for department to refuse to entertain these returns which are filed. And the Supreme Court also said that it would not require the intervention of CBDT. CBDT's consent is not required. 139(5) time limit would not apply, and hence the department was directed to accept the returns which are filed by the transferee companies much later, reflecting returns of losses. Now, so what are the various takeaways of this interesting decision of Supreme Court? We had earlier the decision of Supreme Court in 280 Krishnaswamy's case, where the Supreme Court recognized the concept of lex non cogit ad impossibilia. So law would not expect a person to perform an impossible task. Here is a case where, though the effective date is 1/1/2015, because the court order came much late, the SSC could not have conceivably filed its consolidated return before the original due date. So therefore, the SSC should be permitted to file their returns, consolidating the results of all the amalgamating companies. Second is a situation where the Supreme Court said that even in the case of an amalgamation, section 170, which will deal with succession of business, would apply. See, 170 would apply when a predecessor cannot be found. So there are some doubts as to whether in the case of an amalgamation, could it be said that the amalgamating company is a person who cannot be found? So now that is put to rest by the Supreme Court here. In this case, where the Supreme Court has said that 170 would very much apply, in which case assessment will have to be made on the successor company. And the Supreme Court also said that if interestingly, if in the course of a scheme of amalgamation, if the department would not raise any objection, then department has stopped from raising this objection later on. This interesting observation of Supreme Court will take us to GAR provisions, general anti-avoidance rules, which are coming in chapter 10A, which are applicable from the assessment year 18-19 onwards. As you would know, a lot of questions were raised as to whether an amalgamation is blessed by the court. Can the GAR provisions be still implemented? If you look at the Parthasarathi Som Committee recommendation, which said that if the amalgamation scheme is sanctioned by the court, then the department should respect it and they should not invoke GAR. However, Circular 7 of 2017, the income tax department took a view that even if it is sanctioned by court, if there is any impermissible avoidance arrangement, we could still invoke GAR. Now, here is one decision in Dalmia which possibly works in favor of the SSC to argue that whatever doubts, whatever apprehensions on GAR which the department would have, it will have to rise at the time when the NCLT proceedings are going on. And if they do not raise any objections and accordingly amalgamation is sanctioned by the court and blessed by the court, subsequently very same scheme of amalgamation cannot be treated as impermissible avoidance arrangement so far as invocation of GAR is concerned. The Supreme Court also reiterated one interesting principle, that the procedure is only a handmaid of justice and not a mistress. So end of the day, procedure will have to be relegated to the place it has, and it should be always kept in mind on the basis of what the Supreme Court said in NTPC's case in 229 ITR 383, that the purpose of assessment proceeding is to assess the company in accordance with law. So ultimately, assessment will have to be made in accordance with law, and law will have to prevail, and substantive justice, when pitted against the technicalities, the former should take precedence over the latter. So these are the in Dalmia case. And are there any questions here before I go to the next decision?
Yes, sir. Now, sir, suppose this order of the court was received after the time period of completing the assessment was over, then what would have been the situation, sir?
See, it will have to be the case of reassessment necessarily. It has to be the case of reassessment. And if you go to Marshall and Company's case, Supreme Court decision, which dealt with the scheme of amalgamation, what Supreme Court said that till the assessment is over, till the amalgamation order of the court comes, what the department may do is it may pass substantive order in one company's case, that is proposed transferee company's case, protective orders in other cases, keep the assessment proceedings alive. And once the subsequent order of the court comes, and if the appointed date, as mentioned, the scheme of amalgamation is accepted, it can always drop the protective assessments and confirm the substantive assessments, or it can do vice versa by invoking provisions of section 147.
That's fine, sir. Sir, and sir, if you see the date was 1/1/2015, it
Yes.
relates to financial year 14-15. Then here, sir, in this case, where we are finding it assessment year 2016-17. Why there is a difference?
It does not matter. Yeah, it does not matter because the amalgamation order was sanctioned much later in 2018. So till the court passed its order, it was not known whether the amalgamation would actually take place or not. So it is not only assessment year 14-15, 14-15, 15-16, 16-17, 17-18. All cases, the returns will have to be revised. But in 16-17 is the case where there were losses. So that is why the question which came up before the court was only 16-17.
Okay, fine, sir. Yeah. Any other questions from the group, sir? Fine, I think, sir, you can proceed with the next question, sir.
Sir, there are a few questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
There are. Okay.
Dilip bhai, if you can read the Q&A box, no? There are.
Yeah. I'll just go through.
You'll have to go through.
Yes.
I'll go to Q&A.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, it is from Sumit.
No,
I'll just read it for you, sir. No, it is from Sumit.
Yeah, you can read the questions.
Yeah, it appears that
you can read, sir. Let Mr. Dilip, let one person read out the question.
Fine, sir.
And which could be kindly you. Yeah.
Okay, fine, sir. It appears that the Supreme Court observed that CBDT has no power to give extension of ITR filing. This may be viewed as overruling various High Court rulings. What do you think?
No. Supreme Court did not say so. Supreme Court never said the CBDT does not have power under 119(1)(a), 119(2)(a) to extend the time limit. Supreme Court did not say so. What the Supreme Court said is, in the scheme of amalgamation, the requirement of an assessee having to make a petition to the board does not arise.
Okay, sir.
It did not take away the power of the board. The board has the power statutorily vested in it in terms of 119(2)(a), which clearly mentions the case of 139, it is specifically explicitly stated that power is not taken.
Okay, sir.
You don't need the power at all here because it's automatically permitted to you to file your return later on as per your scheme of amalgamation.
Okay, fine, sir. So the next question is from Mr. Bhaumik Goda. He mentions that how to deal with the following observation of Supreme Court. He mentions, sir, Vodafone SR Gujarat Limited was affirmed by the Honorable Supreme Court in the Department of Income Tax versus Vodafone SR Gujarat Limited, 66 taxman.com 374, wherein the Honorable Supreme Court observed, we are not inclined to entertain the special leave petitions. The special leave petitions are accordingly dismissed. We only state that the Income Tax Department is entitled to take out appropriate proceedings for recovery of any tax statutorily due from the transferor or transferee company or any other person who is liable for payment of such tax. Yes, sir.
See, the decision in Dalmia related only to the case of filing of belated return. The principles as to what would happen in the scheme of amalgamation are found in two important decisions, Saraswati Industrial Syndicate and Marshall and Company's case. Here is where the Supreme Court says that if the order of the Supreme Court comes much later, whereas the appointed date is much earlier, till then, the respective persons will carry on the business in trust for others. And they'll be provisionally filing the returns of income. And as I've said earlier, there could be protective assessment, there could be substantive assessment. And as you would know, whenever there is a demand in the case of protective assessment, it cannot be enforced. A demand against the protective assessment cannot be enforced. A demand against the substantive assessment can always be enforced. So what the department can do is to keep enforcing its demand against the substantive assessments. And later on, once the assessment will have to be redone on the basis of the court order with effect from the appointed date, then whatever taxes paid earlier will have to be readjusted.
Fine, sir. We go to the next question, sir. The next question is, sir, does it mean that one can provide anything in the NCLT order and claim it basis this ruling?
See, it's like this. In the NCLT order, the claim will have to be in accordance with the provisions of Income Tax Act. See, what could be tolerated are only the procedural aspects. It cannot be provided in the NCLT order that the unrelated loss will have to be allowed. A capital expenditure will have to be treated as revenue expenditure. These are not permissible. What the NCLT code does is to sanction something which is legally framed scheme. As you would frame the scheme, you cannot put what is not provided in the Income Tax Act. But what has to be taken note is procedural aspects which are impossible to be performed because of the delay involved in court's approval to a sanction of amalgamation. Those procedural lapses could be condoned and tolerated. The substantive provisions of Income Tax Act cannot be deviated. Yes, sir.
Fine, sir. The next question is, sir, if revised return not possible as per Supreme Court judgment, under which section, under which section to be filed? Under which section the return is to be filed? If revised return not possible as per Supreme Court judgment, under which section the return is to be filed?
You don't require a section to file the revised return. You have to do it in accordance with the scheme of amalgamation which is sanctioned by the court. So there is no need for a section. What the Supreme Court said is, Supreme Court never said revised return cannot be filed. What Supreme Court said is that it cannot come under 139(5). That's all what the Supreme Court said.
Okay,
so
fine,
you just have to file your return without mentioning any section, but referring to the scheme of amalgamation. While doing so, if the e-filing is not permitted, you can always do a manual filing of it.
Dilip, can we restrict the questions to only 2 or 3 per se, because otherwise there will be too many questions?
I think yes.
Dilip, you'll have to screen and just select what is relevant and ask.
Fine. Because the number of questions are many, and I think we should now proceed with the next question, next case study. And thereafter, we'll just accordingly have 2-3 questions on each. I'll try to find out which are relevant and important, and accordingly, I'll put up to the sir. Fine, sir.
So we'll
Fine,
follow
sir,
a procedure, sir. We'll follow
Yes.
a procedure where Mr. Dilip would screen the questions
Yes, sir.
and ask me only those questions which according to him are relevant. And
Fine, sir.
for whatever reason I find that one of the questions which is screened by Dilip Sanghvi, I don't know the answer, I will say question is not relevant.
Okay, fine, sir. No problem.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
now we'll go to the next case.
Next case study, yes, sir.
Next is an interesting case. I would request the queries to Dilip Bhai to defer asking questions on Genpact because there are two important decisions Supreme Court I'm dealing with here. One is Genpact, the other one is Cognizant. So
Okay,
after I complete discussing both the cases, the questions could be asked.
Fine, sir.
Now, take the case of Genpact. You would know that the buyback tax is a private limited company, as you could see the cost title. It's a private limited company. And you would notice that the section 115 QA, which introduced buyback, it was inserted with effect from 1/6/2013. Now, here is a case where you will have in the assessment year 13-14 and in assessment year 14-15 and the previous year 13-14, you would notice that there are two buybacks here. One is in May 2013. The other one is in September 2013. As you could see, the first buyback is prior to 1/6/2013, when 115 QA was introduced. The second buyback is after 1/6/2013, because it took place in September 2013. And interestingly, this second buyback is not under section 77A of the then existing Companies Act. It is rather through a court order. So there could be different types of buybacks. One is normally under 77A. The other is through the scheme of an arrangement, which will have to have the intervention of the court. So here is a case where the court's intervention was sought and a buyback was made, and the total amount of 2,625 crores were distributed as by way of buyback. Now, in this scheme of things, what department did is it made about 10 additions in the assessment order. Out of 10, 9 additions related to normal assessment. The one is a demand raised under 115 QA. As you know, 115 QA is a buyback tax. It doesn't relate to computation of a total income. So what the assessor did is, in respect of 9 issues which related to the computation of total income, it went in appeal to the CIT appeals. In fact, it got the relief also. And against that, the department has gone to the Income Tax Appellate Tribunal and the matters are pending before the tribunal. But in respect of this demand of buyback tax, what the assessor did is, it filed a writ petition in the High Court. As against 10 items, 9 it went in appeal because they related to the quantum aspect. On one which related to the rising of demand on 115 QA, it went to the High Court. High Court initially, in fact, granted the interim stay, but it did not deal with the department's contention that there's an alternative remedy by way of appeal. So there was an alternate remedy by way of appeal, is the contention with the department raised. High Court did not deal with it. It gave an interim stay and it ordered for issue of notice. But at the time of final hearing of this writ petition in the Honorable Delhi High Court, the department persisted with its question on admissibility of the writ petition on the basis that appeal remedy is available. What High Court did is, High Court agreed with the department. It said that yes, appeal remedy is available and you have to go back to CIT appeal, is what the High Court said. Against this order of High Court, the assessee company filed an SLP before the Supreme Court. When the matter came before the Supreme Court considered 2 issues. One is, does an alternate remedy exist by way of appeal? Secondly, while an interim stay was granted at the time of order for issue of notice, much later, at the time when the writ petition is considered for final hearing, can the High Court entertain the request of the department that writ petition should be dismissed and assessee should be relegated to the appellate remedy? So these are the two broad issues which were raised before the Honorable Supreme Court. Now, Supreme Court first considered whether this demand under 115 QA in respect of buyback, is it an appealable issue or not? It examined 246A, subsection 1, clause A, which has broadly three categories. First is a case for an order against the assessee where the assessee denies his liability to be assessed. Then you will have the intimation under 143.1 or rectification of intimation 143.1b. Then you have an 143.3 order. The assessee argued before the Supreme Court that only that relates to 143.3 order could be brought in under 246A(1)(a). Whereas Supreme Court held, look at these three situations under 246A(1)(a). The first situation is a case where an order against the assessee where he denies his liability to be assessed. There is no reference to 143.3, 143, 144. There is no such reference at all. So what the Supreme Court said, this is a very, very broad clause. Any order, including the order passed under 115 QA, could be treated as an order against the assessee where the assessee denies his liability to be assessed. So accordingly, what the Supreme Court said is the order of the department under 115 QA is an appealable order. And therefore, it is covered under 246A(1) within brackets A, the first situation. Once it is an appealable order, and for doing so, the Supreme Court looked at the meaning of the denial of liability, which is used in this clause. And the Supreme Court said that it is comprehensive enough, not only to take into consideration the total denial of liability, but also liability to tax under specific circumstances. And therefore, the Supreme Court agreed with the High Court, saying that it's right on part of the High Court to say that there is an appellate remedy. Now, the next question which arose before the Supreme Court was, as to find there is an appellate remedy, it's not that appellate remedy is an absolute bar in entertaining the writ petition. Now, the question is, could the High Court have entertained it at the much later stage, or should it have decided in the very beginning itself? Here is a case where the Supreme Court said that, firstly, Supreme Court said, look, there's an alternate remedy and you can always go in appeal, first part. And as the Supreme Court said there's an alternate remedy, it followed the decision of Supreme Court in Chabil Das Agarwal's case, 357 ITR 357, an interesting decision in the context of the 147 proceeding. However, in Chabil Das case, the Supreme Court itself gave an escape route. One is a case where the statutory authority has not acted in accordance with the provisions of the enactment in question. Even though there is an alternate remedy by way of appeal, there are different escape routes. One is where the principles of natural justice have not been complied. One is where there is a usurpation of the jurisdiction by the assessing officer. And third is a case where the action of the assessing authority is not in accordance with the enactment in the question. Now, here is a case where this is a context of court-sanctioned buyback scheme. It is not under 77A. 115 QA, till it got amended with effect from 1/6/2016. So it got introduced on 1/6/2013, till it got amended on 1/6/2016, because this buyback took place during this period. Only that buyback which is covered under 77A was subjected to 115 QA. A court-sanctioned buyback, which is not in accordance with 77A of the Companies Act, was not covered by 115 QA at all during the period from 1/6/2013 till 1/6/2016. So therefore, though there is an appellate remedy, here is a case where the department invoked the section when the section was not even applicable. So this classically came under a case where the statutory authority has acted not in accordance with the provision of the Act, and both the High Court and the Honorable Supreme Court ought to have considered this in the writ itself. So here is where, with due respect, according to me, the Honorable Supreme Court did not apply the decision of the Chabil Das case properly in its true spirit. Now, this is what I was trying to explain. Now, in fact, even the GAR, General Anti-Avoidance Rules, were also not in existence during that period. So court-sanctioned scheme of buyback was never in the contemplation of 115 QA at all. The matter went to the very root of it, and it was very apt that the Supreme Court should have asked the Delhi High Court to consider this writ petition and adjudicated the writ. Now, interestingly, so this will give us to some associated question. Now, this buyback was not in accordance with 77A during this period. So, department, in fact, according to me, may have made a strategic blunder in trying to invoke 115 QA. Rather, what they should have done is they should have invoked section 2 within brackets 22. If you look at 2 within brackets 22, clause A, which will deal with any release of assets, any payment which entails a release of asset, or clause D, which will deal with reduction of capital, could have been invoked. And if you look at 222 clause 4, it will exempt only that buyback which is in accordance with 77A. Now, here is a case where the buyback is not in accordance with 77A. It is in accordance with court-sanctioned scheme. So it would have definitely come under 222, and department should have rather invoked 115O and asked Genpact to pay the dividend distribution tax than 115 QA. Now, interestingly, there is another provision here, which is in terms of 46A. If you look at 46A, 46A also deals with the buyback. And 46A deals with not only the buyback under 77A, it deals with all types of buyback. Although there is an explanation to 46A, which in fact seeks to define the specified securities as given under explanation below 77A of the Companies Act. Nonetheless, it is only for the limited purpose of defining what are specified securities. So unlike 222 clause 4, which exempted only buyback, which is referred to in 77A, 46A applied to all types of buybacks. Now, interestingly, department could have either treated it as capital gains under 46A or as dividend under 22. And department would generally not invoke 46A because the moment it invokes 46A, it becomes capital gain, and it's possible for the assessee to make use of the double taxation avoidance treaty with Mauritius or Singapore, where it could possibly avoid payment of tax on capital gains. So it will be in the best of interests of the revenue to stick to invoking only 115O, read with section 222, to say that court-sanctioned buyback will get covered as dividend, and hence 115O ought to have been invoked. So this essentially is a takeaway from the decision of the Supreme Court, although the decision in fact dealt with a different aspect of as to whether there's an alternate remedy, whether it is an appealable order, whether the question of alternate remedy could be raised at what stage. If you look at the facts of the case, you would notice that the department actually committed a blunder in invoking 115 QA rather than 115O. Now, there is one more statement that the Supreme Court made here, which again is slightly erroneous with due respect to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court referred to another decision of the Supreme Court on an earlier occasion, the case of State of UP versus UP Rajya Khanij Vikas. This itself is erroneous. This decision which is referred to itself is erroneous, which for want of time I will not discuss, because it referred to in turn another decision. It totally misconstrued this decision and said that the question of alternate remedy could be raised by the department even at the end stage. At your leisurely time, you can go through this decision, which I'll send the PPT to Mr. Sharma, who could in fact distribute to the delegates, and then notice it, because this may not be very material at this point in time. Now, another interesting takeaway from this decision is, as you would know, there were 10 issues. 9 issues had gone to CIT appeal and then to the tribunal. Now the Supreme Court says this issue will have to go to the CIT appeal. Now it's a case of the concept of merger of an assessment order. When a CIT appeal passes an order, the assessing officer's order merges with CIT appeal. When the CIT appeal passes an order, when the tribunal takes it up, the order of the CIT appeal merges with that of the tribunal's order. Now once the CIT appeal has already adjudicated on 9 issues as against that assessment order, and he's already passed the order, he's become functus officio. He has no more role to play. He has no more role to play. Now, Supreme Court approving the order of High Court by relegating it back to CIT appeal only on the 10th issue will have staggered appeals in respect of the very same assessment order. So this is something which no one argued, no one considered it, and it could possibly create a very interesting situation of, now you have a matter already in the tribunal, and very same assessment here, you have the CIT appeal still sitting with one another issue. It's an interesting aspect that would arise from here. So now this is about GenPat. As I have requested Mr. Dilip Sangvi, kindly hold to your questions as we discuss this case also.
Yes, sir.
There's another decision which is arising from, Madras High Court, which went to the Supreme Court in Cognizant's case. Here also, as you could notice, the cost title is suggesting that it's a private limited company. So why I'm emphasizing on private limited companies, till 5/7/2019, 115 QA applied only to private limited companies, unlisted companies. After 5/7/2019, 115 QA by Finance Act of 2019 was made applicable even to listed companies. Now, here is a case where the buyback took place in 2016, May 2016. And here, because of buyback, huge payments were made to both USA shareholders as well as Mauritian shareholders. For reasons best known to the company, it withheld tax at 10% in respect of payment made to US shareholders. Whereas, when it came to Mauritian shareholders, it did not make any payment of tax. And here is again a case where this is also a court-sanctioned scheme. Like in the case of GenPat, this is not under 77A, this is also a court-sanctioned scheme. And this is before 1/6/2016, because the buyback took place in May 2016. 1/6/2016 onwards, the buyback was made applicable to all types of buybacks, including court-sanctioned buybacks. Whereas here is a case where it's carried out in May 2016. So obviously, buyback provisions of 115 QA would apply only if it is in accordance with 77A. Now, here, what the department did is, it did a slightly different thing here. It did not invoke 115 QA. It rather wrote a letter on 21/11/2017 to SSE, asking why no tax was paid. And SSE made replies. And in the meanwhile, what SSE did is, it went to authority for advance ruling. As the questions were, being tossed by the department and the SSE was giving answers. See, it was not a notice under any particular section. It was just a letter, exchange of letters. So we will not know whether any proceeding could be said to be pending or not. Leave it at that. On 20th of March of 2018, SSE makes an application to authority for advance ruling. So once an application is made to authority for advance ruling in terms of 115 RR, the department cannot proceed with that. But interestingly, on 22nd of March of 2018, just about 2 days later, the department writes a communication. It just writes a letter. In the letter, what the department says is, look, yours is a case of buyback. This buyback took place in May 2016. 115 QA is not applicable because yours is not a buyback under 77A. Yours is a court-sanctioned buyback. So 115 QA will not apply. However, what the department here rightly said is 115 O would apply. It went on to say that 115 O would apply, and accordingly, you ought to have paid tax on 115 O because it is a classic case which is covered under 222 Clause A and Clause D. 222 Clause 4 would only exempt a buyback which is in accordance with 77A from being called as dividend, and yours admittedly is not a buyback under 77A. It took place prior to 1/6/2016, and therefore it is not a case of buyback, but it is a case of dividend. And what the department did is, they issued this letter, went ahead and sought to recover by attaching the bank accounts of the SSE. Now what the SSE did is, it filed a writ petition. It filed a writ petition before the Chennai High Court, arguing that single judge dismissed the writ petition. Though he granted an interim order, he dismissed the writ petition. The contention of the SSE was that it is only a show cause notice. It is not even an order. The letter dated 22 3rd of 2018, it's just a communication. It is not an order. And through the communication, they have sought to recover the tax, which is impossible, impermissible. A proper order will have to be passed. There has to be a notice of demand in terms of section 156. Then only the garnishee orders could be passed to the bankers to attack the bank accounts. But unfortunately, the learned single judge, though he had issued the interim order earlier, he went ahead and said that it is not a show cause notice, it is a proper order. And in fact, single judge went ahead also to say that on merit, it is a case of dividend. So assessee went to the division bench. What division bench did is it upheld the order of single judge in dismissing the writ petition and relegating the assessee to alternate remedy. But it stated that the single judge should not have commented on the merits of the case. But it said that it is not a show cause notice, it is an order. You take it in appeal before the appellate authority. Now, when the matter went to the Supreme Court, the assessee company argued that it is not a case of dividend at all. And it also argued that the intimation dated 22/3/2018 is the most a show cause notice. The Revenue argued that it is a case of dividend, but after the lengthy argument, Revenue conceded that the letter dated 22/3/2018 could be treated as a show cause notice. However, if it were to be treated as a show cause notice and further proceedings were to go on, there is already an application pending before the authority for advance ruling. So department could not have proceeded on the basis of show cause notice. So what the Supreme Court suggested is, it asked the assessee to file an affidavit, withdrawing the application before the authority for advance ruling. 1. It also asked the department to file an affidavit saying that it will treat the show cause notice not as an order, the letter dated 22/3/2018, not as an order, but as a show cause notice, and would hear it on merit and pass a proper order. So affidavits were exchanged, and accordingly, the Supreme Court stated that the communication dated 22/3/2018 will have to be treated as a show cause notice. Matter will go back to the assessing officer, and assessing officer will have to pass a proper order. And what Supreme Court said is, till then, the interim order made by the learned single judge who attacked the bank accounts, who upheld the attachment of bank accounts, and also insisted that the assessee will have to pay 15% of tax, and if not, give a bank guarantee, the interim order is upheld. So now, in sum and substance, what the Supreme Court said is, the communication dated 22/3/2018 is not an order, it is only a show cause notice. So no need to take an appeal now. Let it be treated as a show cause notice. Let the application before the authority for advance ruling be withdrawn. Let the department hear this and pass a proper order. In the meanwhile, the interim order passed will have to remain. So this is what the Supreme Court has said. Now, so what is the takeaway? Now we have had two decisions, one of Genpact, one of Cognizant. In both the cases, it was a court-sanctioned buyback. And this took place between 1/6/2013 till 31st May of 2016. In Genpact case, department invoked 115 QA wrongly. In Cognizant's case, according to me, department invoked 115 O rightly. So look at here the contradicting stand of the department. And both matters went to Supreme Court. And in the later case, the decision in the former case was not produced. So it would have been in the fitness of things that both these conflicting orders were placed before the Honorable Supreme Court in the later order to see as to how department has been taking contradictory stand. Now another interesting fallout of the Supreme Court decision, which according to me was not argued also before the Honorable Supreme Court is, look, what the Supreme Court has said is the communication is a show cause notice. It is not an order. Having said that it is not an order, there is no demand at all against the assessee. When there is no demand, how the interim order of attachment of the bank account could have been continued? First of all, if you would see, there has to be a demand notice for recovery of tax. 156 subsection 1 demand notice. Then you'll have 220 subsection 1, where the assessee will have to pay this. Under 226, where the assessee is in default, either he could go to the tax recovery officer in accordance with Schedule 2 of the Income Tax Act, or he could do the garnishee under 226(3). All these could happen only after a proper demand crystallizes. Now, Supreme Court having held that the communication dated 22/3/2018 is not an order, it is just a notice. How is it possible for them to have continued with the interim order? According to me here, the decision is incorrect. There is no law which will permit department to continue with the interim order, number one. Now, one may ask a question whether as to 281B could be invoked, provisional attachment. If you look at 281B carefully, it will apply only when there is a pendency of proceeding for assessment of income. Please hear me carefully. 281B will permit the provisional attachment during the pendency of the proceeding of assessment of income. So here is a case where there is no case of assessment of income. It is a case of assessment of dividend and subjecting it to dividend distribution tax. So therefore, even 281B also could not have been invoked. And to this extent, with due respect to the Supreme Court, its suggestion saying that the interim order would continue may not be right. Now, this is the same thing which I raised earlier. Now, this would take you back to the scheme of buyback prevalent at various points in time. So you had up to 1/6/2013 when the buyback wasn't there at all. Then you had to examine whether section 222 would apply or 46A would apply. 46A would treat it as capital gain. 222 would treat it as dividend. 222 would treat it as dividend only to the extent of accumulated profits. Whereas 46A will just take the amount received over and above your cost of acquisition as deemed capital gain. Then came buyback tax in 115 QA. It was applicable only to unlisted companies, and it was applicable only to limited buyback under 77A. Then comes 1/6/2016 amendment, where it continued to be applied only to unlisted companies, but it applied to all the buybacks. Then came 5/7/2019, whereby all the companies listed or unlisted for all types of buybacks, you will come under 115 QA, and you have section 1034A, which will exempt it from tax. So it's interesting for us to encapsulate all the different legislative developments in the scheme of buyback period wise, and then put in proper perspective as to how to go about the taxation of buyback. Yes, sir. Any questions on these two decisions?
Sir, there are few decisions, but we have already finished 45 minutes and we have still 7 judgments to go through. So, sir, will it be advisable to take here only, or we'll take it at a later date, sir?
No, we will take here only, because at least 2 questions, 1 or 2 important questions.
Okay, fine, sir.
Just to break the monotony. So
okay, sir. Sir, here, can the treaty benefit be taken with respect to buyback tax levied under 115 QA?
See, the question here for consideration is, the whole objective of 115 QA is to deny the benefit of treaty. So what people are doing is, they were camouflaging payment of dividend as capital gain through buyback scheme. And what people are doing is using Indo-Netherlands Treaty, Indo-Mauritian Treaty, Indo-Singapore Treaty. They were trying to recharacterize dividend as capital gain. So what they did is, they have introduced buyback tax, where the tax is sought to be levied not on the recipient. Tax is sought to be levied on the company. So therefore, it would be difficult for the company as such to be taking any treaty benefit. So all the buybacks were brought in under the Act. And question of a company which is domestic company in India making the distribution on account of buyback, taking the treaty benefit may not arise.
The next question is, sir.
Yes, sir.
What is the remedy available to a company to overcome the Supreme Court judgment on continuation of the interim order of Madras High Court, where 15% of the demand was asked to be paid?
Yeah. So according to me, the remedy is to file a review petition before the Honorable Supreme Court and argue that there are no provisions in the Act to have any interim arrangement, 281B, as I've said, will not apply, and there's no crystallized demand, and therefore it will not be in the fitness of things in accordance with the tax law provisions to proceed with the attachment of the bank accounts. A review petition will have to be tried, but it has to be very properly argued. If not properly argued, it could create a lot of issues like what we're going to discuss in the next case of NRA Steel case. Any more questions, sir?
1 minute, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, isn't dividend and income though to shareholders as per Tata T Supreme Court? Why do you say that Cognizant Supreme Court erred in that point?
No. What did Supreme Court say in Cognizant is only two things. One is the communication is to be treated as a show cause notice. There's nothing wrong in it. Supreme Court did not discuss anything on merit. It only said that communication dated 22/3/2018 is not an order, it is a show cause notice.
Fine, sir. We can go with the next question, sir. Next case study, sir. Yeah, next case study.
Now, there are two decisions of NRA Iron and Steel. It started off with 412 ITR 161. It related to section 68 prior to its amendment. You would know that section 68 got amended later on, which in fact provided that in the case of receipt of share application money, source will have to be established. This amendment came later. Now, this related to 2009-10. Here is a case where the SSC had received a huge amount to the extent of 17.6 crores from Guwahati-based companies, Mumbai-based companies, and Calcutta-based companies at the rate of 200 rupees per share, face value of 10 rupees and the premium of 190 rupees. Now, SSC argued that the entire amount is collected through the normal banking channels, and it also furnished the IT return acknowledgements of all these companies who are subscribed to this, and hence took a stand that the bona fide, genuineness, and the creditworthiness of the transactions have been proved. It was a case of proceeding under 147. And what the assessing officer found is he carried out a survey. He also wrote letters to all his investor companies. And he has found that some of the investors' companies were found to be non-existing. And none of the investors' companies produced the bank statement. And none of the investors' companies appeared before the assessing officer, although they just wrote some letters. And none of the investors' companies justified why did they have to pay 190 rupees premium where the face value is only 10 rupees and whether the company was doing very well or not. And on this basis, on the basis of these findings, the assessing officer added back the entire amount of 17.6 crores as unexplained cash credit under section 68. Now, interestingly, when the matter went to the CIT appeal, CIT appeal said that the company filed confirmation from the investor companies, it filed the IT returns, it filed the PAN numbers, it filed its bank account to see to that the monies have come through the banking channel, and therefore it's a genuine payment, and creditworthiness is proved, the identity is established, and all the three parameters of 68 have been established, and hence CIT appeal quashed the addition, which was upheld by IT-80. You please have to note that the facts found by AO were disturbed by CIT appeal. He returned his own finding of fact, which in turn got accepted by IT-80. And when the matter went into appeal before the High Court, it appears from the order of the High Court that the department did not raise any question on perversity as regards finding of fact. It just challenged the order of the CIT appeal and the ITAT, quashing this addition made under 68. Now, what did the Supreme Court say? Here is an interesting case where several notices were issued. Assessee did not appear. Unfortunately, assessee did not appear. So matter was finally heard ex parte. Of course, the Honorable Supreme Court was gracious enough to give multiple opportunities, but in none of the cases the assessee appeared. So what the Supreme Court eventually did is to hear the matter ex parte, and it noticed that the assessing officer made independent and detailed inquiry, and it found that the field reports revealed that the shareholders were either non-existent, or even if they existed, they lacked the creditworthiness. And what Supreme Court said is any sum found credited in the books in terms of section 68 is very wide and wide enough to include introduction of share capital and share premium. So there is one important finding of Supreme Court here, of course, which is not something which is strange. All along the courts have held that 68 could be invoked even for the share capital. And Supreme Court went on to say that there was no material on record to prove that the share application money was taken from independent legal entities. And survey revealed that some of the investors' companies were non-existing. And inquiries revealed that the investor companies, though they filed the return of income, they returned meager incomes where they didn't have capacity to be investing huge amounts. And none of the so-called investor companies established the source of income, as to from source of funding, as to from where did they get so much money to invest. And Supreme Court said that mere mention of income tax file number or giving a PAN number would not discharge the onus. Now, and accordingly, Supreme Court upheld the addition under section 68. Look at the takeaway here. As I've said earlier, it appears that in the appeal before the High Court, the assessee did not propose any substantial question of law on perverse finding. The Supreme Court in Mohan Kala's case, 291 ITR 178, clearly held, in fact, Mohan Kala case was used by decision in the current case for some other purpose. But it did not use Mohan Kala's ratio insofar as this Mohan Kala held that if there is a finding of fact, unless perversity is established, it cannot be disturbed by the High Court. If it cannot be disturbed by the High Court, it can as well not be disturbed by the Supreme Court. See, under section 254, any finding of fact is final. Any finding of fact by the tribunal is absolutely final. It cannot be disturbed unless a question on perversity is raised. If you go to the decision of Supreme Court in Sudarshan Mill's case, 300 ITR 205, Supreme Court has categorically held that it's important for the appellant to raise a question of law, alleging that the finding of the tribunal is perverse. If such question is not raised, High Court and the Supreme Court would be bound by the facts returned by tribunal. So, unfortunately, in this case, the Honorable Supreme Court did not consider this part of the law which is brought out in Mohan Kala's case, and accordingly, without a question on perversity being raised from the appellant department, it wouldn't have been appropriate, with due respect to the Honorable Supreme Court, to disturb this finding of income tax appellate tribunal. Now, this matter, as I said earlier, was heard ex parte. What the CIT appeal held, what the tribunal held, what the High Court held, all was upset by the Honorable Supreme Court in an ex parte decision. But then assessee got up much later here and he filed a recall petition, which also got reported in 418 ITR in 443 page number. So he filed a recall petition. In the recall petition, assessee pleaded that the court notices were sent to the older offices of our company. Our address is changed. And when we went into the department records, we found that a chartered accountant of the company received the court notice on 13/12/2018. So who received the notice? A chartered accountant received the court notice. The notice of hearing issued by the Supreme Court was received by the chartered accountant of the company on 13/12/2018. It was hand-delivered to this chartered accountant, whose name is Mr. Sanjeev Narayan. Now, company argued that the chartered accountant gave an affidavit wherein he stated that he had only had a limited power of attorney, only to appear before the income tax authorities. Obviously, him not being a lawyer, he could not have got the authorization to appear before High Court and Supreme Court. He also, in the affidavit, stated that when he received this service on 13/12/2018, he mistook it to be some other document and he did not ever think that it is a notice from the Supreme Court. And he also mentioned that he underwent a cataract operation on 4/1/2019 and 23/12/2019. So he underwent cataract operation, as a result whereof he was not able to attend to his office properly because he was suffering from eye problems, sight problems. Now, so therefore, company also made one more argument before the court. It's an oral argument without any averment in writing, without exchange of pleadings. Company made an oral argument saying that the chartered accountant is not a principal officer. Hence, the service of notice by the Supreme Court to a chartered accountant who is not the principal officer is bad in law. Now, revenue did a commendable job here. What the revenue did is, it found out that this chartered accountant, after this date of receipt of the order of notice of the Supreme Court on 13/12/2018, and before his surgery, on various dates, he appeared before the income tax authorities in respect of that company and other group company matters. So contrary to his claim earlier that because he had eyesight problem, he could not attend to it, after the receipt of the notice of the Supreme Court and before the date of surgery, on at least 5 dates, he went and appeared before the departmental officials in other matters. So this proved his claim wrong, is how the department argued. Now, Supreme Court, on the basis of all these counter arguments, eventually held that you cannot accept that the chartered accountant believed that this is not a notice from Supreme Court. This is something else. There is no way the deponent who gave the affidavit, the chartered accountant who gave the affidavit, mentioned as to when did he actually open the dusty notice. And because he represented the company on other occasions, his claim that he was suffering from eyesight prior to eye surgery could not be accepted. So, and Supreme Court went on to say something else which is extremely dangerous. What the Supreme Court said is, chartered accountant held the power of attorney. Because he held the power of attorney, he is an agent. And because he is an agent, he is the principal officer under section 2 within brackets 35. And therefore, chartered accountant is an agent and hence the principal officer. The service of notice by the Supreme Court to the chartered accountant is a proper service of notice to the company. Now, so what is the takeaway from this decision, particularly the recall petition? One, you have to be extremely careful when you make an affidavit before the court. Whether you are a chartered accountant or you're a lawyer, you'll have to be circumspect in writing an affidavit, because here is a case where you wrote before the Supreme Court on oath stating that you had eye problem and you could not have attended to the notice. You couldn't even have opened it and given it to the client. It is your claim. But department found that on 4 occasions he appeared thereafter before the department officers. Actually, the chartered accountant is very lucky that the court did not initiate an action on him for misleading the court on this. Then, next aspect is when you argue before High Court or Supreme Court, even before the tribunal. So, the takeaway from this decision is that you cannot raise any argument orally very lightly unless you are thoroughly prepared. So, here is a case where an oral argument was raised saying that chartered accountant is not a principal officer. You should know the mind of the court. Now, if you make this oral argument, court has to deal with it. And the way the court has dealt with it will make all the chartered accountants who have got the power of attorney to appear before the income tax authorities and the principal officers. It's extremely dangerous and far-reaching if it is invoked by the department, like the way they are known to be doing it. In fact, argument should have been made as regards the Supreme Court rules of 2013, which dealt with how to issue notices. Case law analysis ought to have been carried out. Section 282 ought to have been properly explained. Without any of these preparations, an off-the-cuff argument orally was pushed saying that CA is not a principal officer. Now, can CA ever be principal officer? A chartered accountant would have a power of attorney given to him, which is extremely limited. It's not a general power of attorney. It is a specific power of attorney. It will permit him to appear before the tax authorities, make pleadings, sign the documents, receive the notices. So it is restricted to that. If you look at section 188 of the Indian Contract Act, an agent will have an authority to do such thing which is authorized to do. A specific power of attorney cannot go beyond the brief of it. Similarly, when you go to 196 of the Indian Contract Act, when an agent does something on behalf of the principal which is not authorized to do, principal may disown the act. For example, here is a case where the chartered accountant is not authorized to receive notice from the Supreme Court. If he has received it, it is permissible for the company to disown the very receipt itself, because he doesn't have the power in terms of 196 of the Contract Act. He doesn't have power to receive it. The chartered accountant should have refused to receive it. Even if he has received it, it does not amount to a proper receipt. After all, you have to understand that it's a matter of procedure. See, end of the day, matter will have to be heard. Both parties have to make their representations. So the least the Honorable Supreme Court would have done is, could have been benignant enough to allow the recall, hear the party again, and decide whichever way it wanted to have decided. Now, in fact, the very first decision which we discussed today, 428 or 339, is by the same dispensation. The honorable judges are the same, who delivered NRA, who delivered Dalmia. When it came to Dalmia, the Honorable Supreme Court said that the procedure is only a handmaid, not a mistress. And justice will have to be done at any cost. Whereas when it comes here, having known that it is a chartered accountant who had only a specific power, who did not have the general power, and therefore there is no proper receipt at all, and hence the company in the least could have been asked to make its representation. In fact, there is a very important decision of the Supreme Court in S. Nagaraj versus State of Karnataka, where they said the justice is a virtue which transcends all barriers. Neither the rules of procedure nor technicalities of law can deny the rendition of justice. The court should not be prejudicial to anyone. Even the law bends before justice. Extremely important. Even the law will bend before the justice. The root from which the power flows is the anxiety to avoid injustice and to cause justice. And this is neither statutory nor inherent. And technicalities apart, if the court is satisfied of injustice, then it is constitutional and legal obligation to set it right by recalling its own. So unfortunately, this is something which the Honorable Supreme Court ought to have considered, which it did not. Now, calling a chartered accountant or a lawyer who has this limited power as the principal officer would have far-reaching consequences. Look at section 201, which casts an obligation in the case of a company on its principal officer to deduct tax at source, otherwise he is said to be an assessee in default. Under 201(2), there's an automatic charge on the principal officer of a company if the tax is deducted but not remitted. And you will have section you have various other provisions of Income Tax Act. If you look at section 140, which requires signature, a principal officer in some circumstances could be signing. Prosecution could be launched if the principal officer is found to be guilty of laxes. So to say that a chartered accountant or a lawyer who has a very limited and a specific power of attorney as an agent of the company for all purposes, and to treat him as the principal officer of the company under section 235 is extremely a far reach and an outreach, and if implemented, it would cause a good amount of trouble to the practicing chartered accountants and lawyers. So with this, we will take questions on these two decisions.
Sir, the questions are there. What I think you have already answered the questions in your discussion, in your takeaways, sir. So I think we can go with the next case study, sir.
Yes. So next is a wonderful decision. I wouldn't say it is with all the humility at my command that it's the right decision, but it's definitely a very useful decision. Now, here is the case of Seshasai Steel Private Limited. Here is a case, I'll just explain you the facts. Assessee is the landowner. It will, be of interest to those who deal in real estate matters, those who are into joint developments, those who would deal with granting of possession, granting of power of attorney. It will have far-reaching implications in rest thereof. So, Mr. Dilip Bhai, we have another 20 minutes to go. So, I may possibly discuss this decision and then our time will be up, I guess.
Sir, I think we do one thing. We do away with the questions and whatever possible, if you can continue, if you have time, sir. Because I think the participants will not mind. Sir, we are having, at one time we had crossed the limit of 5. We had just finished 500, sir. What maximum could join, sir.
Oh,
so I think for the benefit of all, if you can, without taking the questions, you can discuss the issues, because your detailed analysis will be very helpful to all, sir. Please,
we will go up to 1 o'clock, sir. We'll go up to 1 o'clock.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah. Yes, sir. Now, here is a case where a landowner enters into an agreement to sell, and notice the date here on 15/5/1998 with one builder. And in that agreement to sell, consideration is agreed at 5.5 crores, and he will give permission to this builder to start advertising, selling, and constructing flats on land. And it doesn't stop here. Soon after, within the same year, he will give a power of attorney. And it is not a very simple power of attorney. It's a very comprehensive power of attorney which will permit the developer even to sell the flats which he'll build, execute the sale deed, conveyance deed. And this is the kind of, the sale agreement and joint development agreement and the power of attorney, which took place in the year 98-99. What happened is, of course, assessee did not pay any tax in this year. He did not offer it to tax under 247(5), 247(6), nothing. He just did not offer it to tax. And it so happened that in the financial year 13-14, there were some serious problems with this development agreement. It was found that the assessee had already agreed with somebody else to sell this property. He had a prior right, so it got into dispute. And finally, a compromise deed was entered into, memo of compromise was entered into on 19/7/2003. So what the assessing officer did is, he sought to levy tax on capital gains on the basis of this memorandum of compromise in the assessment year 2004-05, not in 98-99. He sought to do it in 2004-2005. See, assessee went to CIT appeal. CIT appeal found that 247(5) could not be implemented because this compromise deed itself would establish that there were problems. So the agreement, original agreement of 1998 was not in fact put into effect, and therefore 247(5) will not get attracted because 53A itself did not get attracted. And tribunal, upon further appeal, agreed with it. Now, matter went to High Court. When the matter went to High Court dismissed the appeal, and High Court took one more ground which influenced the mind of the High Court. Oh, in 98-99, you did not pay the tax. Because you did not pay the tax in 98-99, you cannot take a plea that in assessment year 2004-05, you also don't have to pay tax. What High Court was thinking is the complete avoidance of tax, either in that year or in this year. Fundamentally, the proposition of High Court is not correct, because Gajapati Naidu's case, 53 ITR 114, Supreme Court said that the right year is the only year in which the income can be charged tax. Just because in 1 year where it ought to have been charged tax, it has not been charged tax, it cannot be charged tax in any other year, because under Section 5, it accrues in 1 year, that's it. It cannot accrue in any other year. Anyway, this is which possibly would have influenced the mind of High Court. This is not the topic of a discussion now when we go to Supreme Court. So assessee takes it to Supreme Court. Now when the assessee takes it to Supreme Court, now one more point which needs to be noted here is the facts. The compromise deed dated 19/7/2003 provided that various amounts had to be paid to the landowner. that apart, the prior right holder, Pioneer Homes, one party who had this right prior to assessee getting into agreement with the developer, he also had to be paid. And the compromise deed provided that once the last payment is made, which happened on 25/1/2004, which actually fell in financial year 3/4 and assessment year 4/5, the assessee is completely divested of all his rights in land, and he ceased to be the owner of the land. His right in the land stood extinguished on 25/1/2004. Now, what is the assessee's argument before the Supreme Court? Assessee argued that in the year 98-99, he gave the possession to the builder. And he permitted builder even to build the flats and sell the flats. Therefore, 247(5) is attracted because it is a case of allowing the possession to be retained, granting the possession in pursuance to part performance of the contract under Section 53 of the Transfer of Property Act. And hence, it's a classic case of 247(5). Transfer has taken place in 98-99. No need to pay tax in 2004-5. If at all department has to do anything, it has to take recourse to 98-99 by reassessing if it is permissible within the limitation of time. Assessee took another argument. Okay, it's not 247(5), at least 247(6) is attracted because the assessee executed a general power of attorney. So it gave away all the rights through the power of attorney to the developer. And therefore, it is not taxable in 2004-2005. What Supreme Court said is this. Supreme Court said, look, it went into the development agreement. It looked at a clause there. There was a clause saying that it is only a permissive license given under Section 52 of the Indian Easements Act. It is not a possession. So sticking to this particular caveat in the development agreement, Supreme Court said possession here is a legal possession. It is not the physical occupation of land. You may have permitted him to build flats. You may have permitted him to sell flats. But your agreement very clearly says it is not a possession under 53A. It is only a license in terms of the Indian Easement Act. And therefore, Supreme Court said 247(5) is not attractive. In fact, Supreme Court went on to say this is enough to say that this clause itself is enough to say that 247(5) is not attractive. Now, when it comes to the case of 247(6) on the basis of general power of attorney, Supreme Court said, if you look at 247(6), it says any transaction by whatever name called which has the effect of transferring or enabling the enjoyment of an immovable property. Supreme Court went back to its earlier decision of Balbir Singh Maini's case. The same learned judge who heard this case also ruled in Balbir Singh Maini's case. Justice Nariman is the judge who authored both the decisions. He went back to the decision and said that the phrase enabling of enjoyment of is influenced by the word transferring. So non-sitter principle was applied, where transferring got the enabling the enjoyment of got influenced by the word transferring. So there has to be a de facto transfer which ought to have taken place. Mere execution of a general power of attorney would not mean invocation of 247(6). So both 247(5) is gone and 247(6) is gone. And what Supreme Court said is, it is only in 2003-04 financial year, upon the last payment made, your right as an owner stood extinguished. And therefore, Supreme Court said, if at all 247(6) is attracted, it is attracted in the assessment year 2004-05. Two clauses could be attracted according to Supreme Court. One is 247(2), which dealt with the extinguishment of any rights in an asset, or 247(6), which enabled the enjoyment of immovable property. Either of the two or both, according to Supreme Court, took place only in the financial year 3-4, assessment year 4-5. And therefore, the department is right in seeking to tax the assessee on this. No. So what is the takeaway here? The most important aspect is a license per se is not a possession. Here is a case where possession, according to Supreme Court, is to be a legal possession and not the de facto control of physical occupation. And unless and until legal possession is transferred, 53A is not attracted. Now, look at various decisions so far. If you scan through, at least a dozen of tribunal benches have held that even if there is a clause saying that it is not a possession, it's a permissive license in terms of the Indian Easement Act, we will go by substance over form, where a developer is virtually allowed to change the contours of land, change the character of land, build superstructure, and therefore it is effectively in substance a possession which is given. Now, it is not the physical control of land, it is the legal possession. The decision of Supreme Court will upset all these decisions. And in all the case of joint development agreements, wherever a caveat is added, that what is given is not a possession under 53A, it will protect the case of the landowner, and 247(5) cannot be invoked. Even if a power of attorney is given, look at the facts of the instant case. Apart from JD, a power of attorney also is given. And it's a complete comprehensive power of attorney which permitted the developer to build apartments and even sell. No, Supreme Court said this by itself would not help. And this significantly reduced the scope of 45(5)(a). 45(5)(a), which was brought in about 2 years before, to help in the case of an individual and HUF to pay tax in the year in which the completion certificate is issued. In the case of joint development, where there's an area sharing model. Now, you need not invoke that if you are able to overcome 247(5) and 247(6) merely on the basis of a recital in your development agreement that what is given is only a license and not a possession. Now, adverting to 247(6), Supreme Court says mere execution of general power of attorney would not in any manner mean a transfer under 247(6). Now, 247(6), here is a case where the Circular 495 of the department issued in 1987 said that the objective of 247(6) is to consider the power of attorney transactions. Now, power of attorney transactions by themselves don't come here unless there is a complete de facto transfer that ought to have taken place. Now, look at one interesting thing here. You may recall the decision of Supreme Court in S.H. Sanjeev Lal's case some time back. Here is a case where only an agreement was entered into, and it was a case of Section 54. There was an agreement entered into. Subsequently, transfer took place much later because of a dispute. Assessee sought to claim benefit of Section 54. Because his claim of 54 was much ahead of the time of transfer, it's more than 1 year before. So department denied the benefit. Matter went to Supreme Court. Liberally construing Section 54, Supreme Court said even an agreement to sell, which was executed on 27th December of 2002, could be treated as a debt on which the property could be transferred. So this decision created a lot of ruckus, although it was a favorable decision. To call that a mere agreement as a transfer may be little too much of an outreach. Now, this decision is undone to some extent by the Seshasai case, and it will override this decision to the extent it runs contra, for the reason that Seshasai is a decision by a bench of 3 honorable judges, whereas Sanjeev Lal is the division bench case. Now, next is Gar. So interestingly, you see here, if you see the facts of the case, in substance, there is actually a transfer. Complete power is given to the developer. But the Supreme Court went by the form, not by the substance, merely because there is a recital in the development agreement that it is only a license. Supreme Court went by it. Now that the GAR has come into play, if the department finds in terms of Section 96, it's an impermissible avoidance arrangement, and the tax benefit in terms of Rule 10U crosses the threshold of ₹3 crore, it may be open to the income tax department to invoke GAR and to some extent undo the decision of Supreme Court. Now look at another interesting fallout of this decision. This is Benami Property Transaction Act. You know that the Benami Amendment Act came into effect from 1/11/2016. And most of the courts, except the Chhattisgarh High Court, Even Supreme Court in Magantai Ammal's case held that Benami provisions which have been brought in by 1/11/2016 are prospective. You have Niharika Jain's case, you have Joseph Ishrat's case, you have Ganapati Dealcom's case. Of course, the Supreme Court has granted stay as against the decision of Calcutta High Court in Ganapati Dealcom's case. Except Chhattisgarh High Court. Rest of the High Courts have held that the provisions are prospective. Now, the impact of this decision on Benami is, if it were a case of 53A and a case of 247(5), and if that event took place prior to 1/11/2016, I would argue that the Benami provisions would not apply to me because there was already a transfer prior to this cutoff date. Now, with this decision of Supreme Court in Seshashayi case, if you could not have invoked 247(5) prior to 1/11/2016, the defense that was available to you earlier is no more available, and you may possibly will get hit by the Benami Provisions Amendment Act. So this is one fallout of an adverse fallout of the decision of Honorable Supreme Court. So that's about this. I think Mr. Dilip Sanghvi, my time is up.
So time is up, sir, but if it's convenient, you can take up one more decision if it is possible for you, if you have time, sir.
Yeah, one more decision is the case of Supermall's case in 115 taxman.com 105. You all may have known about the Calcutta Knitwear's case. The Supreme Court decision earlier in 362 ITR 363, which said that where there is a case of a search where the documents and the assets belong to other party, the satisfaction is a sine qua non. Now, in this interesting case, and board issued a clarification or a circular later on 94, circular number 94, or circular number 24, where the board said that even if the assessing officer of the searched party and assessing officer of the other party are one and the same, recording satisfaction is a mandatory requirement. So in this case, the search took place in Tejwan Singh's case and Bharti Prakash, Ved Prakash Bharti group of cases, whereas the other party is one Supermalls Private Limited. A pen drive was seized and it was found that Supermall was making like on money. It was selling shops at on money basis, so beyond the registered value. And assessee argued before the Supreme Court that the satisfaction note was not kept in the file of the search party. And satisfaction note looked like this. Name of the assessee, they have written the name of Supermalls, who is the other party. So assessee argued that satisfaction note should have been made with the name of the searched party and not the other party. And it should have been kept in the file of the searched party. And subsequently, the documents and other assets will have to be handed over. There has to be a ceremonial handing over within himself, just for the sake of formality. So these were the arguments made. So what Supreme Court said is, Supreme Court recognized that yes, recording satisfaction is a sine qua non, but it went into the satisfaction note and it felt that the way the satisfaction note is recorded is absolutely fine. And it virtually reiterated in verbatim what the Delhi High Court in Ganapati Fincap's case said, 395 ITR 692. And it stated that there is no need to write two satisfaction notes. It is enough if the satisfaction note is recorded qua the other person, not by the assessing officer in his capacity of other person. By the assessing officer in his capacity of the such person, he has to record the satisfaction note qua the other person, meaning assets don't belong to the such person. Assets and documents would belong to the other person. So one single satisfaction note is sufficient, is what the Supreme Court said. And Supreme Court went on to say that there is no need to hand over the documents. There is no need to hand over the documents. So this is the finding of the Supreme Court. And Supreme Court in this case sought to follow Calcutta Knitwear. Calcutta Knitwear in the context of 158 BC block assessment said that it's a sine qua non that the satisfaction note will have to be recorded by the assessing officer of the such party. So now, if you go back to the satisfaction note, it looks like name of the assessee is not mentioned as the such party. Name of the assessee is mentioned as the other party. Now, in capacity as assessing officer, which party has the assessing officer recorded this satisfaction? It looks like on the basis of the satisfaction note that is acted as the assessing officer of the other party and recorded satisfaction, which is plainly not in accordance with the law. Who has to record the satisfaction that the documents belong to somebody else? It is the assessing officer of the such party. In fact, in this scheme of things, he should have named the assessee as the such party, and then should have stated that the records and the documents found here belong to somebody else, supermalls. Then he has to proceed in his capacity as assessing officer of the supermalls. But unfortunately, this technical aspect doesn't seem to have been communicated properly to the Supreme Court. No emphasis is laid on the satisfaction note. Supreme Court also overlooked the way the satisfaction note is written and held that it is enough if the single satisfaction note is recorded. Now, the takeaway from this decision is, this decision to say that single satisfaction note is necessary is no more the good law, because 153C is amended now. 153C now requires twin level satisfaction. First level, there are two satisfaction notes now are required. One is by the assessing officer of the such party, saying that the documents and the assets seized belong to the other party, one satisfaction note. And having done that, he has to hand over the documents to the other party. Now, the other party, assessing officer of the other party, will have to have a separate satisfaction note saying that the assets which are handed over to him will have a bearing. The information and the documents which are handed over to him will have a bearing on the assessment of the income of the other party. Oh, separate satisfaction note is now contemplated under 153C. So after this amendment in 2016 to 153C, so we have to make an endeavor to distinguish the case of this particular supermalls case, to say that this would not apply anymore now. Now you require two separate satisfactions. Even if the assessing officer is same, he has to record two satisfactions under 153C. So that's about supermalls case.
Thank you, Chaitanya ji, for an excellent analysis.
There are certain other decisions like Maruti Suzuki and other things possibly in the next occasion we will discuss NDTV case, Maruti Suzuki case, etc. Right now, I think the time is up. We could possibly stop.
Fine, sir. Sir, there's a request from many members that whether you can share your PPT, sir.
Yes. What I'll do is I will mail the PPT to Mr. Sharma, who can in turn, give it to all the delegates.
That's very nice of you, sir.